Alright, so here's the second video where I promised you that the stuff we talked about in that first video will start to make more sense. And I think it will. So we're going to focus here on the necessity argument, which I'll outline shortly. And yeah, I'm going to split this really up into two. So we're going to talk about the necessity argument in this video, and then we're going to talk about in the next one the freedom argument. So we'll see that there's a link between these two arguments, but I'm doing them in two separate videos. I don't know, to make them into more digestible chunks, I suppose, because I want you to be clear about this argument before we move to the one about freedom. So human free will is going to turn out to be important. Alright, well, let's just get started then. Here was the question that I raised at the end of the last video. The question was, does alethic closedness entail modal closedness? I'll try and spell that out in a bit more in a comprehensible detail in a minute. And that's how I said what it means. Well, let's delve into this a little bit more. To make it clear, let's take a particular proposition about the future. In the book, I think we use the example of an emu farmer, or Eva becoming an emu farmer. Let's take a different proposition. Let's take Ben will die in 2021. So there's a proposition, and let us suppose that this proposition is true now, right? So it's true at the present moment that I will die in 2021. So you can imagine that being the case on something like an eternalist view, right? If the future is already laid out, then it might be that somewhere up the timeline is in 2021 is my death. So let's take that as being true, okay? So we're supposing that it's true. Then we can say that the proposition is alethically closed, okay? So remember, alethic openness was just to say that the proposition is alethically open at a time t, if and only if it is not true at t and not false at t. Well, if we're supposing that this proposition is true at t, the present moment, then the proposition is alethically closed now, okay? Well, the question is that given this, is it also modally closed? That is it necessarily true that Ben will die in 2021? I'll keep referring to myself here in the third person, but it's because we want to keep the proposition in mind. So, if it's true that Ben will die in 2021, does it follow that it's necessarily true that Ben will die in 2021? And lots of people have been taken in by the thought that it must be. And here's the argument for this. So this is the argument that an alethically closed proposition, or a proposition that is alethically closed, it tells that it's also modally closed. And by the way, you know, just to point out, this is just an arbitrarily chosen proposition about the future. If there's any true proposition about the future, this conclusion is meant to follow, so we can plug, as it were, any proposition about the future in here, but we're taking this one as our example. And here's the necessity argument, and it runs like this. Okay, this was our supposition, so we started with this. It is presently true that Ben will die in 2021. That was what we're supposing. Okay, well, if it's presently true that Ben will die in 2021, then it is impossible for Ben not to die in 2021. That goes to thought. You know, think about the eternalist picture. Well, if the future's already there, and it's such that there in 2021 is me dying, and that's just laid out and it's already there, then I must die. Surely it's impossible. I've got, you know, there's nothing that can happen given that it's already there where I could change that, and so it looks like it's impossible for me not to die in 2021. And if it's impossible for me not to die in 2021, then that's just the same as saying it's necessary that I'm going to die in 2021, because, right, that's what it means to say that something, say it's impossible for me not to die, it's just to say that it's necessary that I will. So it looks as though we can move from the idea that if it's true now that I will die, or Ben will die in 2021, that it's necessary that Ben will die in 2021. And that's the argument. And that has convinced lots of people. People think that that's a good line of argument. And that means, of course, that there aren't any contingent facts about the future. So take the eternalist view, where the entire future is laid out, it looks as though there aren't any contingent facts about the future at all. Therefore, like every fact about the future is necessarily true. If that's right, if this argument is right. Now, there are some people who think that all truths about the future are necessarily true. For example, this guy, Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher of the, not very good with dates, of the 18th century. Yeah, I think he was. So he believed that the future is modally closed, that is, everything that will happen in the future will necessarily happen. And he had various reasons for this, principle of sufficient reasons to do with God and so on, which we're not going to go into. So it's just to say there are some people who have bought this conclusion, or some philosophers that have bought this conclusion, that all the facts about the future are in fact necessarily true. The future can only develop in one way. However, the argument, I think, is fallacious, the necessity argument, and David Lewis puts his finger on why. And this is a bit, I do recommend you have a look at the Lewis argument. I'll post it in the extra readings for this week, and it is an interesting article and goes into, but I'm really interested in the basic idea of Lewis's article here, which I'll explain in a minute. But here's the quote from Lewis: "I'm not going to vote Republican next fall. The fatalist argues that, strange to say, I not only won't but can't, for my voting Republican is not compossible with the fact that it was true already in the year 1548 that I was not going to vote Republican 428 years later. My rejoinder that this is a fact sure enough, however, it is an irrelevant fact about the future, masquerading as a relevant fact about the past, and so should be left out of account in saying what in any ordinary sense I can do." So I do recommend you go to the article and see if you can unpack this idea of facts being compossible, and it does give you a kind of a deeper insight. But I think the basic idea that Lewis is trying to get across can be expressed easier than this. We don't have to talk about compossibility and the idea that we've got relevant facts masquerading as irrelevant facts masquerading as relevant facts, and so on. The basic idea, I think, is much simpler, or much simpler to get across. So what is this basic thought or basic idea? And it's this: well, that a proposition is true does not entail that it's necessarily true. Generally speaking, that's not the case. And whether it's a proposition about the future, or the past, present, or future, it makes no difference, right? It doesn't matter whether that proposition is one that's about the future, whether it's about the present or about the past. Truth does not entail necessary truth. Okay, those two notions are different, and let's try and spell out why. Well, look, here's one way of getting to this thought. Just take a particular proposition about the present moment, right? So, as I'm recording this, I'm standing up, because I like to record these videos whilst I'm standing. So, take the proposition, Ben is standing up, okay? That's alethically closed now. So as we defined alethically closed, it doesn't have to refer to propositions about the future. Remember, it just said a proposition is alethically closed or alethically open if and only if it's not at a time, if and only if it's not true at that time and not false at that time. Well, I'm standing up now, so it's now true that I'm standing up. So the proposition that Ben is standing up is alethically closed because it's true now that I'm standing up. Okay? Well, given that, we can plug it into the necessity argument. We can plug it in as follows. It is presently true that Ben is standing up. Okay? If it's presently true that Ben is standing up, then it's impossible for Ben not to be standing up. If it's impossible for Ben not to be standing up, then it's necessary that Ben is standing up. Therefore, it is necessary that Ben is standing up. So all I've done there is I've substituted in a proposition about the present instead of a proposition about the future, and run the same argument. But the form of the argument doesn't depend upon whether the proposition is one about the future or the present. So here's the thought here. Okay, yes, I am standing up, but I might not have been standing up. That is, it's not necessary. Think about this in terms of possible worlds. I am standing up in the actual world, but there are other possible worlds where I'm not standing up, right? So that means it's not necessary that I'm standing up. So even though it's true I'm standing up, it's not necessary that I'm standing up. Okay? It could have been that I wasn't standing up. That's all we mean when we say that something is not necessarily true. We mean it could have been otherwise. So yes, I am in fact standing up, but it could have been otherwise, so it's not necessarily true that I'm standing up. And there we see that the same line of thought will apply with the future proposition. So you can say, yes, it's true now that I will die in 2021, but there are other possible worlds where I don't die in 2021, so it's not a necessary truth that I will die in 2021. So it doesn't follow from the fact that that it's true that I will die in 2021, that it's necessary that I will die in 2021, for the very same reason that it doesn't follow from the fact that I'm now standing up to the idea that it's necessary that I'm now standing up. And we can think about the past as well. I don't know. So the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066. Okay, that's a fact. It's true now that the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066. So that's a lethically closed proposition. Does it follow that the Battle of Hastings necessarily occurred in 1066? Well, no, it might not have happened. The history might have gone differently, and the Battle of Hastings might not have occurred at all. So although it's true that the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066, it's not necessarily true that it did, because things might have been different. Likewise, therefore, if the fact that the past is fixed in that sense of being true, there's truths about the fact, it doesn't follow that they're necessary truths about the past. Exactly the same applies for the future. Even if it's true that I will now die in 2021, it doesn't follow that I will necessarily die in 2021, because things might there are other possible worlds in which I don't. There are other ways future could be in which it doesn't happen. I hope that's the illuminating bit, I think. I think once you get that, it sort of sits oddly. How can it be yet true and yet that it's going to happen and yet might not happen? Well, it's exactly the same thought of the fact that there are things that are true about the present which might not have been true about the present, and things true about the past which might not have been true about the past. The future in that respect is no different from the past. So in other words, here what we're just breaking apart this idea that just because something will happen, it doesn't mean that it will necessarily happen. The same as just because something did happen, it doesn't mean that it necessarily happened, and the fact that something is happening doesn't mean that it necessarily has to happen or is happening. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that that is illuminating, and we'll see that it's important to get clear about that for when we come to the next video, which is going to be to do with freedom, and this is going to apply there as well. But the thought to keep in mind is this: it does not follow from something's being true that it is necessarily true. That's just a general fact. You can't infer that something is necessarily true from the fact that it's true, and it doesn't matter whether that something is a something about the past, the present, or the future. They're all on a par in that regard. So I hope that that's somewhat illuminating, and we'll see. Bear that in mind when we come to the next video about freedom.